So thanks everybody for coming and joining us on this first of our PCC forums of the new academic year, and we're especially grateful to have Joshua Ramey with us. A lot of you, I think, already know Josh or have met him. For those of you who don't, or for those of you who might be listening or watching this later, let me say a couple words about Josh. I heard about Joshua's work back in, I think, 2006 or 2007, when I was trying to do some writing for my PhD on Giordano Bruno and Nicholas Okuza, and my advisors told me, you need to keep an eye out for this guy who's doing work on Bruno. This guy named Joshua Ramey, who just graduated from Villanova with his PhD. And lo and behold, a year later, I found myself sitting next to Joshua at a panel in which I was doing a little presentation on Bergson, and he was doing some of his Hermetic Deleuze stuff.
Wait, I walked in the middle of Jake's paper.
Yeah,
I was
so
half an hour late for the panel.
When I found myself sitting on a panel, yeah, it was, I found myself sitting next to a chair, and then there was Joshua suddenly. He hermetically materialized in the middle of the talk. But I followed his work a lot since then, as I know many of you have. Joshua is currently a visiting assistant professor at Haverford. He's been an invited lecturer at the Deleuze summer schools. He's published recently a book with Duke University Press, The Hermetic Deleuze. There's a second volume of responses to that that's coming out with Punctum, entitled Gilles Deleuze, Spiritual Scientist. He has a new book coming out with Palgrave on the politics of divination, moving further into this exploration of the contested region between philosophical speculation and religion in the contemporary world. It's all very exciting things. We're really pleased to have him here at CIIS. I think the kind of things we've been doing here are very resonant with the areas that Joshua's been pushing into, so it's really nice to have a chance to bring it together and for a couple of different communities here to mingle and get to know each other. So with that, let me say welcome to Joshua Ramey. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thank you so much, Jake, for organizing this and setting it up, and forgiving me for such a rude introduction. I walked in late on your talk 7 years ago. I was saying to Jake in the hall that I think it's easier to prepare to talk to your enemies than it is to talk to your friends. And I definitely feel like I was coming here to talk to my friends. So I hope that any shortcomings in the presentation will be forgiven, but I really am excited to be here. Because what Jake said is absolutely right. The material that I've been trying to work with for a long time, and that others of you in this room I know are working with as well, is explicitly the concern of a place like CIIS. So I couldn't be happier to start sharing what I really feel like I'm just beginning to think about with this new book project here with all of you. It's also a sort of homecoming for me. I grew up in Northern California, and as much as I love living in Philadelphia, I miss this place in all kinds of ways. I grew up in Lake County and in Sacramento, and spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, and really grateful to be here to talk about my work a little bit. We've got until about 4:30, I guess. The talk is about an hour long. That's, I think, at least 20 or 30 minutes longer than most of us can pay attention anymore, myself included. I hope you can bear with me, and then hopefully that'll give us at least 45 minutes to unpack this a little bit further. I'm really anxious to hear what all of you have to say in response to what we're trying to set up here. So, going to start with two quotations that I'm not going to comment on, but just leave as headings for today. First is by Henri Atlan from his recently translated book, The Sparks of Randomness. He says, after the end of prophecy, the judicial status of serpentine knowledge obtained through omens and divination seems to be summed up in the rule that one may interpret omens if one does not rely on them when deciding how to act. In other words, it is acceptable to employ this type of knowledge on condition that you not allow yourself to be governed by what you think it tells you. The second quotation is from Alex Galloway's 2012 book, The Interface Effect. No politics can be derived today from a theory of the new. The reason is simple. We have never known any form of modernity except that form of modernity subservient to the new. We have never known any form of modernity except that of market accumulation, increased profit margins, development of productive forces, rises in productivity, new jingles, the latest fads, and so on. These are the currency of the realm. It is time now to subtract from this world, not add to it. The challenge today is not a political or moral imagination, for this problem was solved long ago. Kill the despots, surpass capitalism, inclusion of the excluded, equality for all of humanity, and exploitation. The world does not need new ideas. The challenge is simply to realize what we already know to be true. Perhaps only a fool can speak to us of chance. Only a fool does nothing but take his chances, setting out over the abyss of the unknown, rolling the dice on life itself. Only a fool risks everything, stakes everything on chance without calculation or reserve. It may be impossible to speak of chance directly without sounding like a fool. A chance event is that which does not occur in conformity with a known or possible law. But already the ambiguities are multiplied. Even if an event occurs in conformity with a law, but the law remains unknown, it's still necessary to speak of the event as if it were by chance, to relate to the event as uncertain, unpredictable, and random. If all knowledge is, as Aristotle defined it, knowledge of the necessary or the regular, then if anything happens by chance, it seems that nothing can be known about such an event. That is to say, strictly speaking, nothing can be known on the basis of chance. From the point of view of knowledge, that is to say, knowledge of causes, chance is always meaningless, always absurd. And yet, for human history as we have known it, and perhaps for before we can remember it, we seem to have always presumed that chance is meaningful. We can, in fact, know by chance. Language begins to play with us here. If we presume we can know by chance, it seems as if we are presuming we know alongside a chance, next to chance, in company with chance. So let's play the fool. If a chance event is an event whose cause is unknown and perhaps unknowable, what is it that we seem to know by chance? For all their high seriousness, it seems philosophers have not been above playing the fool. For the ancient materialist or the late antique Stoic, we know our destiny by chance. We find our place in a universe of totally determined causes precisely by chance, through the cultivation of a persona that becomes equal to, or worthy of the destiny that befalls it. On the other hand, for the Platonists, or perhaps for the medieval Jew, Christian, or Muslim, a providential God orders all things such that chance, while apparently a source of chaos and evil, is ultimately ordered, beyond all knowing, in an eschatological finality and perfection that upon arrival will retroactively reveal the meaning and purpose of what was apparently vague, random, confusing, or even destructive. But what is it practically to keep company with chance? It may be many things, but it is most certainly what we do when we practice divination. We can come back to this later because there's a lot here. this is a little bit about how I'm working on defining divination in an extremely general way. Generally speaking, divination has a synchronic dimension. This is what I call the necessary condition of divination, where it's a systematic yet indirect mode of producing or reacting to chance, such that a given chance occasion itself reacts upon a finite set of material elements so as to render what is taken as a meaningful sign generally regarded as an oracle or auspice, where I deliberately leave those terms in the moment undefined. It also has a diachronic dimension, which I call the sufficient condition. Divination discerns the significance of the single occasion, which is what's going on here, only in relation to a series of investigations, which you can think of as a tradition or a craft, whose potentially infinite elaboration over time is implicated in any single cast. Two more aspects of this for me. One is what I call the inductive mantic continuum. And this is what I also call the generic condition of divination. When you look at global divination practices, you see that they occupy points, and oftentimes these points are indiscernible, between, on the one hand, a kind of taking of signs by what you can think of as mechanical means, like casting dice or the I Ching or runes of tarot or something like this. And on the other hand, a modality of receiving signs through non-mechanical states that are described in a number of ways, because of intensified contemplation, mode of intuition, entering an entheogenically induced state, and so on. That's yet another dimension of what we mean by divination. There's also a fourth aspect that I call the soothsaying contemplation polarity. And we can talk more about this at the end of the talk, because it'll come up later. But basically, the point is there. I'm not going to take you any further into this for now. But it's very clear that while divination is often used for fortune telling and for thinking about the future, it's also used globally, both in ancient worlds and contemporary worlds, as a contemplative practice for deepening one's powers of attention, regardless of whether one is interested in discerning whether certain events will take place in the future. We can talk about all of that as we go along. Divination systems worldwide, ancient and modern, present themselves as matrices by means of which to communicate to and through chance. The oracle speaks on the basis of chance upon an occasion that is unique, unrepeatable, and singular. The exact position of the heavenly bodies, the spread of the runes, the gathering of the arrows, the flight of the birds through the divided quadrants of the sky, the season, day, and hour of the strike of lightning, the roll of the dice. Each of these events is by chance, in the sense that the exact combination of elements, the exact conjuncture of the trajectories, the exact intersection of vectors could not be predicted in advance. That's how natural scientists would define it in our day. Further, such an occasion cannot be repeated, at least not in relation to the totality of other events that are rendered significant by the oracle, since even if we were to cast the same oracle twice, some time would have already passed, and the total situation would have changed, even if ever so slightly. In other words, for divination, what makes chance meaningful is not the uniqueness of the event to court, but the way the oracle takes up that event in relation with the unlimited totality of what has come before, and to some extent, with what may be yet to come. So, this is going to be somewhat crucial for what follows. In divinatory practice, it's not chance itself that is oracular. In divination systems, it's not chance that's sacred. Rather, the presumption is that there is a sacred oracular relation to chance possible, in the sense that chance is presumed to be able to play a role in a prophetic, meaningful, potentially reconstructive renewal of relations between the concerns of those who divine and all that with which they are concerned. This is as true for the Stoic or Spinozist, who in some sense reveres the unfolding of reality as such, as it is for the monotheist, who reveres eschatologically what will have been a transformed world. And across a variety of religious cultures, the ethnographic literature shows that we can allow for a multiplicity of relations as subject of divinatory concern. Relations among human beings, of human beings to themselves, to collective or individual pasts, to collective or individual past, presents, or futures, relations of human beings to animal, plant, and generally ecological, living and dying, relations of humans to ancestors, spirits, even to absolute, unique, almighty gods. For surprisingly, divination has played and continues to play an extraordinary role in monotheistic traditions, despite the fact that animist, shamanic, and polytheistic traditions are epistemologically, ethically, and politically much more comfortable with the theological implications of the practice. But this modern secular person seems much less willing to play the fool. Secular modernity seems possessed of a Faustian ambition, undreamt of by the ancients, the ambition to discipline and even eliminate the role of chance, partly on the basis of the development of scientific knowledge, partly on the basis of technological systems of surveillance and control. Not only theoretically, but practically, the pre-modern paradigm seems to presume that chance cannot be spoken of directly, dealt with directly, but only on the basis of complex mediations and intricate meditations. The modern person, however, impressed by the sciences of probability, cybernetics, systems theory, and the new logics of emergence, chaos, and complexity, seems to think we can know the likelihood of certain kinds of future events, like changes in weather, death rates, effectiveness of drugs, and the movement of prices in the marketplace, by means of the direct investigation of chance. In this sense, the modern scientific person seems not to know so much by chance as to know in and of chance, as if chance could be mastered, dominated, coerced, and controlled. Before we go further with our interrogation of the modern attitude to chance, it's necessary to take a step back, assisted by this paragon of sober judgment, the Hierophant. In some sense, nothing could be more obvious that life as we know it is marked by irreducible contingency. Life and time are marked by change, by unforeseeable events, and by the interruptions of patterns thought to be immutable. Life is marked by chance. From the collapse of civilization to the implosion of stars, from market fluctuations to the ebb and flow of desire for a partner, contingency rhymes with existence. What could be more concrete than contingency? And yet, when we come to think contingency philosophically, things get very abstract very quickly. In recent philosophy, Quentin Meillassoux has even attempted to argue that contingency is another name for the absolute, for that which cannot be denied of reality as such. Meillassoux defines contingency as the possibility of something, an entity or event, to be or not to be. Here Meillassoux joins a prestigious lineage of modern philosophers, extending through his master Alain Badiou, back ultimately to ancient Democritean materialism. According to this tradition, the material world, such as it is merely the instantiation of an abstract possibility, a random selection from an innumerable number of possible worlds that may or may not have been realized. But there is another dimension of contingency that is not captured by the definition of the contingent as that which can possibly be or not be. This dimension of contingency is that of relationality. Contingent being, as the great Islamic philosopher Ibn Sina pointed out in the 11th century, is that which exists in and through another. or that which cannot exist except in relation to another. This tradition of thinking contingency as relationality, at least in modern thought, extends from Spinoza to Schelling, C.S. Peirce, Whitehead, Bergson, Deleuze, and Bruno Latour. The project I'm working on here and want to give you a glimpse of is organized as an extension of thinking contingency as dependency and relationality. But rather than remain at the level of abstraction, my argument takes the ongoing crisis in political economy as a way of understanding what is at stake in thinking contingency as relationality, not only philosophically, but as a social form, and in the last instance as a mode of piety, as a spiritual and in the strong sense religious perspective on reality. Now, one extremely abstract way of thinking about economics is that it is a study of the kinds of relations human beings contingently organize to deal with the reality of human contingency. This sense of economics evokes a more ancient and modern sense, the sense of the Greek oikonomia, as all that which pertains to the household, to the management of bodily needs and desires, of all that is required for human health, well-being, and survival. In the modern era, economics has become synonymous with marketplace activity. And under global capitalism, it is almost exclusively by and through marketplace interactions and through marketplace competition that we seek the means not only of survival, but also of health, wealth, mutual recognition, honor, prestige, and glory. The fluctuations of marketplace activity are a mode of radical contingency, as price shifts signal not only changes in supply and demand, but also political upheaval, ecological instability, changes in cultural norms, and the continuous influence of monopolies, cartels, and speculators who can determine flows of credit and underwrite the maintenance of debts. Since its origins in moral philosophy in the 18th century, the science of economics has radically changed, evolving from an evaluative and normative discipline to one that now claims, on the basis of the axiomatic neutrality of its observational position, to be able to make positive, non-normative claims about economic behavior and activity. These claims are masked in complicated mathematical models and findings of statistical significance that obscure the controversial nature of key axioms and make public debate over policy and principle nearly impossible for the uninitiated. The pretense to positivistic objectivity, not only in economics, but in the social sciences generally, has been criticized so heavily in the last 50 years that we could fill this room 10 times over with books on the topic. Unfortunately, popular and political culture is still deeply impressed by these claims, so much so that we treat economists and successful business people as oracles, wizards, and as those who have effectively the power to practice rites of divination on our collective behalf. This point is not original. Economics has been accused of being a form of divination, both by those who don't want it to try to predict the future because it cannot, and are thus reformers, like Deirdre McCloskey, and by those who, like Nicholas Taleb, say economics can't do anything but sell us such snake oil, and thus the entire discipline should be dismantled. But what if the problem is not how to purge economics of divination, but actually how to fully embrace the necessity of economics as a mode of divination? What if economics should be, but is not yet, a true form of divination? In his superb 2009 book, Theology of Money, the philosopher and critical theorist Philip Goodchild has suggested that financial speculation in particular is a disguised form of divination. While McCloskey allows that incorrect economics is like divinatory magic, with the argument that all magic, including divination, is false and worthless, and Goodchild argues that actual financial speculation is a form of divination, likewise with the implicit argument that we should be entrusting ourselves to people other than economists. My hypothesis is that true economics would be true divination. And in this project, I have three working axioms. This is the first one. In contemporary conjuncture of misappropriated statistical science with vested interests of wealth and power is unleashing a catastrophic auto-cannibalization of human and non-human potency, fomenting a culture of increasing fear, instability, and precariousness seemingly bent on the systematic destruction of unique and irreplaceable ecologies. Increasing aggregate global wealth is not incompatible with an increasingly enslaved and hoodwinked population, a population that must sacrifice its uniqueness for its survival. Nor is it incompatible with the large-scale destruction of Earth systems generally. It is possible for us all to be dead or to be very, very rich. As an evaluation of value, too. I try to pretend that I'm dead already to trick them, but we'll see how that goes. As an evaluation of values, economics is not a neutral, objective affair of observation, but a value-laden science of the sacred, an affair of knowledge, intuition, and commitment, whose ultimate roots are, in fact, in divination. By divination is meant not so much soothsaying or forecasting, which much of economics appears to be, but rather that economics as generally practiced is divination, in the sense of an obscure, distorted, and perverse form of true divination, understood globally and generically to do less with prediction than with persistent human efforts to make meaning through material practices, evoking chance as a means through which to receive otherwise unavailable signs. Three, the problems that plague political economy and attempts at economic rationality, even when economics has been fully purged of all hubris and ideology, are still deeply intractable metaphysical problems. In particular, problems of how to interpret chance and contingency. And such problems can only be addressed through philosophical interpretations of the significance of the limits of knowledge and an ongoing reevaluation of human and non-human potency in relation to the obscurity, ambiguity, and unforeseeable contingency that marks existence. I hope some people in here can help me do that. Okay. In his unjustly neglected philosophy of civilizations, the new science, the 18th century Italian Giambattista Vico offered a fascinating speculative hypothesis about the origins of human language, religion, and culture in rites of divination. Vico hypothesized that after the universal flood recounted in the biblical record, the errant sons of Noah, Ham, and Japheth wandered far into the wild forests that would have dominated the Mediterranean basin after the deluge. These Mediterranean gentes, or pagans, cut off from divine revelation and from the antediluvian knowledge of divine law, became semi-feral creatures, without homes, customs, or even language. Those who managed to survive this brutal existence were, quite literally, giants. Noah's son Shem, the good son, remained with his father and became the source of the Jewish people, who for Vico had an important and distinct development from their other Near Eastern cousins. Now, based on philological evidence about the roots of Latin words for law, justice, and the name of God, Vico concluded that the giants must have begun to speak and thus to become civilized again at the moment that they began to respond to the great flashes of lightning that would have seemed to them, in their primitive poetic minds, to have emanated from some obscure personality manifest in the heavens. When the giants take lightning as a sign, they immediately generate language, ritual, and culture in response. By imagining a meaning for themselves, they project themselves as the particular kinds of beings that receive, interpret, and return signs to an obscure source of agency and intention. Enough like them to communicate with, but unlike them enough to leave the substance of the communication up to interpretation. Vico speculated that the giants, solitary and uncivilized, lived alone and simply fornicated with whatever women were at hand, abandoning them immediately afterward. Can't imagine that girl giants would have been able to do it the other way around, but hey, it was the 18th century. But the institution of interpreting the messages of the heavens cause the giants to remain in one place, their sacred spaces, and to constrain the women to do so as well, thus distinguishing themselves from those who continued to wander in the forests. Eventually, the giants who commit themselves to the procuring of auspices, making their marriages sacred and their domiciles their kingdoms, begin to recognize one another as an heroic class. This, for Vico, was the origin of aristocracy, in an heroic fraternity that distinguishes itself from those wanderers who do not have the auspices, and whose lives are thus not sacred or worthy. Eventually, when wandering peoples came to seek refuge with those giants who had remained in one place and provisioned for themselves, such family, the word for family actually means hungry in Latin, and it refers to these, Vico thought anyway, to these sort of wandering peoples. These family are treated as slaves and denied the right to sacred marriages or to the procuration of auspices generally. Now, this sounds insane, but Vico grounds much of this speculation in the development of Roman civilization, which is precisely a history of the appeal of the commoners to participate in public life by having their marriages recognized and by being allowed to retain their own lands. The appeal that is made by the people is an appeal to be allowed to practice divination, along with the heroic aristocratic classes. That is, to be given initiation into the mysteries of providence and the sacred character of judgments. Although he was a skeptic about the value of this practice, Cicero's On Divination explains in great detail the extent to which the procuration of auspices was a legally sanctioned and crucial aspect of Roman law and governance well into the 1st century BC. For his part, Vico surmised that with the rise of Christian civilization, rooted in Jewish bans on idolatry and on the usage of divination as a technique for determining guilt and innocence, which is one of its uses actually in Roman law, the sacrificial and idolatrous basis of social cohesion in the procuring of offices would be overcome. The early pagan giants' simple intuition of a transcendent source of judgment would pass from the idolatrous manipulation of the auspices for the purposes of human caprice and be transformed into the true and complete dispensation of divine justice equally to all, announced in the Jewish and Christian revelations in Scripture. But Vico also surmised that all civilizations, even those of his own emerging early modern Europe, grounded upon rule of law, would eventually relapse into a kind of barbarism. In a mode of criticism that evokes that of Plato, Vico believed that the bid for equality among citizens would end in a tyrannical chaos of conflicting private interests, unless a kind of ideal monarch would emerge to properly educate the desires of the people in virtue. Like Plato, Vico retained this idea as a kind of eschatological possibility and restricted his view of providence to the idea that humanity would never completely lack the means to reconstitute the basis of civilization, no matter how much destruction it invited upon itself. What Vico did not account for in his theory of theological modernization and secularization were, among other things, two key elements. In the first place, the monotheistic traditions, especially Judaism and Christianity, but also to some extent Islam, are much more ambivalent about divination than Vico made out to be the case. The Bible is riddled with occasions on which lotteries and other modes of divination are explicitly commanded by God, from the discernment of hidden sinfulness by sortilege in the book of Joshua to the casting of lots to replace Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus to the Jewish authorities. In subsequent Jewish and Christian traditions, vestiges of divination remain, from the mystical practice of meditations upon chance combinations in the letters of the Torah to the evangelical Christian practice, a practice which itself evokes the conversion scene of St. Augustine, of randomly opening scripture and allowing one's eye or finger to fall upon a passage that is supposed to be relevant to one's concern. And perhaps most importantly, Vico takes no notice of the ways in which esoteric and mystical currents in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam overlap profoundly with ostensibly pagan modalities of animistic and shamanistic relations to the divine, including complex meditational practices involving techniques of divination. That's the first lacuna. The second is, Vico did not foresee the way in which modern developments in the sciences of probability would inspire natural and social scientists to engage in large-scale projects of prediction, some of which involve fallacious but nevertheless extremely seductive dreams of control, dreams that themselves reconfigure idolatry and to a more sinister extent exonerate sacrificial logic, as scientifically sanctioned decisions beyond public debate are made about who and what to insure against future disasters or where and when to invest limited human time and resources. So unfortunately, the theology of providence and human freedom, Vico thought, would underlie the democratic, egalitarian, and progressive ambitions of modern civilization, remain haunted by the unsettled question of how to relate to chance, and how to evaluate, exonerate, appreciate, or critique the various modes of divination that continue to be practiced, covertly or explicitly, with sincere or sinister intentions on the line. And to complexify things even further, and perhaps most importantly for us, the world of global civilization is an ultra-modern or post-colonial era in which the vast diversity and multiplicity of human divination practices, as well as cultural diversity per se, outside the arc of the West, reveal both continuities and discontinuities between modern, secular modes of knowledge and archaic practices, such that the moderns are forced to recognize with Bruno Latour that they have never been modern. All these factors are sources of a profound confusion marking the modern attitude to chance. This confusion, at once both profoundly private and obscenely public, iconic and idolatrous, magical and scientific, is one of the most intractable elements of contemporary political impasse, pointing to deeply unresolved and perhaps irresolvable issues in metaphysics and theology. We're about halfway through, so if you stand up and do some yoga poses and back, cool. In his 1968 masterwork, Difference in Repetition, Deleuze put the problem of the modern attitude to chance in terms of a polarized opposition between two fundamental approaches. One that recognizes with Stéphane Mallarmé that a throw of the dice will never abolish chance, and thus opening the space for divination. And on the other hand, an attempt to domesticate and even dominate chance. This is Deleuze. There's a lot going on here that I'm not going to comment on, but we can certainly discuss it later. Throw of the dice is in no way suggested as an abolition of chance, the sky chance, the absolute chance. To abolish chance is to fragment it according to the laws of probability over several throws, in such a way that the problem is already dismembered into hypotheses of win and loss, while the imperative is moralized into the principle of choosing the best hypothesis which determines the win. And that's obviously the tendency to want to control the dominant chance. By contrast, the throw of the dice affirms chance every time. Each throw of the dice affirms the whole of chance each time. Repetition of throws is not subject to the persistence of the same hypothesis, nor to the identity of a constant rule. The most difficult thing is to make chance an object of affirmation, but it is the sense of the imperative and the questions that it launches. Chance is arbitrary only insofar as it is not affirmed or not sufficiently affirmed, insofar as it is distributed within a space, a number, and under rules destined to avert it. When chance is sufficiently affirmed, the player can no longer lose, since every combination and every throw which produces it is by nature adequate to the place and the mobile command of the aleatory point. I'll come back to that later. Now, as I argued in my first book, The Hermetic Deleuze, one can find throughout Deleuze's corpus these kind of cryptic affirmations of esoteric modes of knowledge, by means of which the mind becomes adequate to cosmic depths and potencies. Clearly, that last phrase could have been written as an affirmation of divination, however abstract and open-ended it is, as Deleuze puts it. But for the moment, it is the other character, this modern domesticator of chance, with her theories of probability, who requires our attention. For there is something not only rather fearful, but also deeply confused in the probabilistic attitude to chance, the confusion that comes out most clearly in our perpetually mistaken assumptions about what can be inferred on the basis of statistical testing of hypotheses. Statistical tests of random samples, that is, tests that invite profound comparisons with divination procedures, enable us to at least eliminate certain hypotheses as so extremely unlikely as to be called for all intents and purposes false. Yet, despite hundreds of articles and books written to try to correct this error, the results of statistical trials, which in almost every case do no more than eliminate possible causes for a phenomenon, are constantly presented as if they have made positive identification of causes. Every single day in the newspaper, it's a big, big problem. As the French geneticist and philosopher Henri Atlan has argued, the contemporary obsession with discovering, for instance, the genetic basis of disease and developmental patterns, like the obsession with hormones in the 1950s, amounts to a kind of persistence of this sort of magical thinking. The search for a total cause or complete explanation of a phenomena of which we can only ever have partial knowledge. As Atlan points out, in the case of genetics, there are a number of factors exogenous to the genes, environmental factors especially, but also the presence or absence of proteins necessary to activate genetic programs, such that genes can in no sense be said to cause living organisms to manifest particular traits. Even worse, statistical trials often reveal nothing about the cause of a phenomenon, but only the effectiveness in the short term of treatments or of other interventions. Even if Ritalin is effective in treating ADHD, this in no sense proves that ADHD is caused by brain chemistry that Ritalin modifies. It may simply be that the brain chemistry manifested in those diagnosed with ADHD is correlated to the environmental, social, traumatic, and historical factors which likely play roles in producing 5-year-olds who happen to have more ambition, drive, and creativity than there is room for in classroom situations designed to drain such demigods of all ambition, drive, and creativity. Now, it's all too obvious that the misuse of statistical reasoning is motivated by profound material and intellectual interest in the discovery of certain results and the testing of certain hypotheses to the exclusion of others. Those hypotheses, for example, which examine whether a drug will be effective or not, will be tested extensively by the pharmaceutical companies invested in such testing. The hypothesis that social and political factors are at work in ADHD will go unfunded. But the problem is not how to undermine the legitimate role of statistical research or the development of probability theory as scientific methodologies. My problem, anyway, is to clarify what this exceedingly modern form of divination can and cannot do, and to understand why it is that inferences to causal knowledge are constantly made in contexts where, at best, we are in fact merely eliminating certain possibilities. That is to say, where we should be learning to live with our ignorance. The development of a probabilistic perspective on the world should enable us to cultivate an attitude of humility, patience, attentiveness, and heightened awareness of contingency and complexity. And yet in the last instance, the probabilistic perspective, especially in the human and social sciences, particularly in economics and psychology, but also in the natural sciences, particularly biology and medicine, is generally used as a means by which to reduce the complexity of the causal situation and to force energy and resources into short-term technological fixes. Again, it is extremely tempting to moralize. The organization and deployment of economic, medical, demographic, and other data seem clearly to align with class interests, the interests of dominant power structures, and self-immunizing institutional frameworks. But, fortunately or unfortunately, there is a much deeper problem lurking behind the self-interest of power and privilege in its perpetual self-preservation. It is only by mentioning this problem, which is one of the greatest paradoxes of probability theory itself, that we can begin to conceive of the particular way in which modern scientific culture, and especially the discourse of mainstream economics, can and must be understood as the exacerbation of unresolved conflicts of perspective on chance and the way in which contemporary institutions, especially under the logic of global capital, are set on a course to defer this conflict indefinitely, creating a situation that is both dangerous and apocalyptic. The following paradox, as rendered by Henri Otlon, reaches back to the earliest debates in probability theory between Pascal and Fermat. Although the odds of throwing and not throwing a 6 become roughly equal in 4 throws, more than 24 throws are necessary if we are playing with 2 dice, and the winning throw is a double 6. Put it another way, the probability of not winning decreases with the number of losing throws, but more slowly. In a game with 2 dice, the naive gambler is more likely to go broke if he insists on waiting for boxcars to come up after a long streak, necessarily finite, in which it has not done so. So, it's hot in here, it's late in the afternoon, I'm sure you get the point, but statistically, if you keep losing, trying to throw a double 6, eventually the odds are going to get better and better that you will, at some point, hit pay dirt. The problem is, you're finite. As a gambler, you only have a limited number, a limited amount of money to spend on your throws. So even though you're right that eventually your odds, the odds should be in your favor, you really can't stay in the game that long. The problem with a naive gambler is not that he does not understand probability theory. In other words, the gambler who thinks, I'm going to keep playing even though I'm losing big here because every time I lose, my chances are getting better. The longer he plays, it's true, that the longer he plays without throwing a winning set of boxcars, the more likely it is that eventually he will roll them and hit pay dirt. But the law of large numbers, upon which he is relying, presumes only that this chance will come up eventually against a series of infinite throws. In reality, the gambler has only so much cash to stake, and thus is advised, even if he's been on a losing streak, not to keep betting he will win eventually. Now, there's a strange asymmetry here. Even though the gambler is correct that over time it's increasingly unlikely that he will not eventually roll double 6s, she has no idea how likely it is that on this throw, in particular, she will roll double 6s. In other words, it's easier to calculate the improbable than it is to quantify the probable. And as Otlon puts it, quote, this is the source of the rule, all too often ignored, that we should calculate probabilities only to rule out a belief, and never to confirm it, whether or not the belief is intrinsically justified. Now, even on the basis of this relatively simple example, it's easy to see how much is at stake in our desire or even willingness to treat life as a game of chance in which we are all implicated. And indeed, Otlon asks, why is it that in concrete circumstances facing a natural or social phenomenon to which we must apply the rules of the calculus of probabilities because we have no better option and are ignorant of the details of governing mechanisms, why is it that we act as if these situations obey the same laws as a crapshoot? There seems to be the tendency of modern institutions, however, not so much to attempt to abolish chance, that is, to plan and prepare for every contingency, as it is that they treat populations and their various levels of wealth, health, interest, and so on as temporary and contingent outcomes. Oh, sorry, I should have rewritten this sentence. Let me try this again. All right. It seems to be the tendency of modern institutions not so much to attempt to abolish chance, as it is to treat populations with their various levels of wealth, health, interest, and so on, not as temporary and contingent outcomes of human interpretation, but as unquestionable, unarguable effects of chance, justifying a global social situation in which intervention is never institutionalized for individuals, but only for populations. As for aggregates and averages, whose existence and specificity is treated as arbitrary. Anyone who has spent time in a hospital recently knows this. It's not you who are treated, it's your disease. Likewise, it's not you who are hired, but your resume, and so on. And yet, the dehumanization and impersonalization that characterize modern institutional life are agreed to as indices of the commitment to impartiality, fairness, objectivity, and even justice that are supposed to mark an advance over tribal, aristocratic, or otherwise hierarchical social structures that treat individuals as irreducibly unique. That is to say, we seem to have tacitly agreed to treat our individuality as arbitrary and meaningless in order to pronounce our lives equally worthy of attention, with the paradoxical effect that no attention can legitimately be given to an arbitrary instance of a generality. It's only the general rule that counts. But the problem is that if the rule is only discovered on the basis of the law of large numbers, we must not only presume, but produce a human reality that is homogeneous enough and continuous enough over time to manifest a true law. This, of course, is precisely the ambition of what Michel Foucault called biopolitics, to inspect, govern, and eventually reproduce optimal, efficient populations, in keeping with an ideal of maximum adaptability of those populations to increasing precariousness, ever-diminishing resources, and ever-increasing ecological instability. So what is it, in the last instance, that justifies the idea that human life is a game? This is certainly not a modern idea, but it has a peculiarly modern form under the aegis of the science of probability. As Ottman puts it, we invoke chance under the auspices of probability when we are in a situation where adequate knowledge of the causes of a phenomenon is absent, when knowledge of the mechanism by which a particular event can be generated to occur is not available. But our understanding of what it is possible or necessary to do in the face of given statistical likelihood is never obvious and still subject to interpretation. For my purposes here, what the paradox of the gambler shows is that our interpretation of the fairness of games, especially economic games, is deeply equivocal. Since it is not exactly hyperbolic to suggest that life as we know it simply is the ritual religion of capitalism, it is fair to say that the dogma of the religion of contingency that underwrites our sense of the justice of economic endgame is the following sinister equivocation. Capitalist religion, on the one hand, imagines an ultimate reality that has the formal structure of a game of chance that will go on indefinitely with or without human beings. And two, it ignores, for the purposes of ramifying the possibilities inherent to that game, the material, ecological, social, and spiritual resources required to play the game indefinitely. This is our gambler's problem, even though, according to the law of large numbers, he is right that the longer he loses, the more likely it is that he eventually will win. The problem is, he's not resourced to stay in the game that long. Practically, only the 1%, only the most wealthy, can play the game of chance, according to its own logic. Thus, in order to maintain the status quo, the ruling classes play these two axioms off against each other. When an individual is an apparent victim of being under-resourced, we refer to the first axiom, shrug our shoulders. In a world of random chance, some are resourced and some are not. Tough luck. The true reason for failure, of course, is almost entirely that the person in question was without resource among the majority, the outcasts of the world. And yet, when an individual is clearly profoundly well-resourced, her success is said to be by chance, that she was lucky, or that her individual pluck and determination overcame the odds. When, of course, there are always extraordinary resources at hand that make such overcoming possible. What we are doing here is obviously morally pernicious and politically invidious, but the key is the way that an epistemological and perspectival impasse over the nature of sorry. Let me start that sentence again. This is why I've never pronounced the talk on the adult side paper. Okay. What we're doing here is obviously morally pernicious and politically invidious, but the key is the way that an epistemological and perspectival impasse over the nature of chance is overcome in the last instance by a commitment, a religious commitment, to a sacrificial ritual that is at one with the current economic endgame. And this will be the last section of the talk. It's finally time to confront the emperor, the dismal science of economics itself, from the perspective of divination. Even incredibly sophisticated defenders of capitalism, such as Deirdre McCloskey, complain about the fact that despite the warnings against forecasting and prediction made by the giants of economic theory, from Adam Smith to Karl Marx to Keynes to Hayek, economic reasoning and the prestige of economic judgments nevertheless continue to occupy a position that is almost equivalent to that of prophecy, oracular wisdom, and divination. It is this persistence that interests me, this kind of disavowal, whereby despite the fact that we know that economic wisdom cannot predict the future, we nevertheless continue to believe and rely on economists for what we imagine, in spite of it all, will make at least some of us rich. It is this latter problem, at once religious, psychological, and political, that McCloskey stops short of addressing. But she at least gives us a stunning critique of conventional thinking, mistaken thinking, about what economists can and cannot know. In her 1990 book, If You're So Smart, The Narrative of Economic Expertise, McCloskey eliminates the possibility of profitable economic forecasting with a single, simple example. The example begins with the exact axiom of modest greed. If the average person sees a quarter in the street, she will sidle over to it and pick it up. If the same person sees a $500 bill in the street, she will jump for it. The axiom has a simple but devastating conclusion. If the axiom of modest greed applies, then today there exists no sidewalk in the neighborhood of your house on which a $500 bill remains. Proof of this is by contradiction. If there had been a $500 bill lying there at time t minus n, then according to the axiom, someone would have picked it up before t, before today. What follows from this simple example is that anyone who is offering you advice about how to find $500 bill on the street in your neighborhood is not to be trusted. As McCloskey succinctly puts it, if there really were a $500 bill lying there, the confidence man would pick it up himself. Now, despite the protests of the advice industry, extraordinarily successful business ventures, including speculative ventures, are a matter of luck, of chance, of happening to be in the right place at the right time, of guesswork, intuition, inspiration, and not of calculation. McCloskey, of course, acknowledges the usefulness of business advice about the past, that is, advice that can help you make routine predictions that are within the margin, that is to say, that are not at all extraordinarily profitable. Now, what's fascinating about McCloskey's argument here is that she's at great pains both to identify what the vast majority of economic advising pretends to do, but obviously cannot do, as a form of magic, sorcery, and divination. She thus scolds her own discipline for failing to live up to its modern, secular, scientific calling. And yet she does so in order to connect economic wisdom directly to a kind of poetic wisdom, an art of telling compelling stories, in the sense of tales of what may be, of what can possibly be, based on a concerted and imaginative effort to understand human experience as we have known it. And this is a couple of slides to give you a sense of her point here. She says, economics is the science of the post-magical age. Far from being unscientific or hoo-ha, it is deeply anti-magical. It keeps telling us that we cannot do it, that magic will not help. Economics, like poetry, however, exhibits sometimes a nostalgia for magic. There's the danger. Economics can go wrong and betray its post-magical sophistication by surrendering to the temptation of magic. Now, of course, words are efficacious in economics because markets live on the lips of men and women. Every economist knows this. Money is not a thing, it's an agreement. Corporations are not corporeal. Exchange is the conversation of bids and asks. The economy depends today on the promises made yesterday in view of the expectations about tomorrow. It can, in fact, and in word, create prosperity by declaring it to be just around the corner. One is tempted to conclude that economies and economics are mere matters of words, that announcing a 5-year plan or a new economic policy is the same thing as achieving it. That words, after all, do have the magical power to make us safe and happy. Grown-ups must resist this temptation. Grown-up economics is not voodoo, but poetry. or to take other models of maturity in its history, not myth, politics, not invective, philosophy, not dogma, a virtual psychoanalysis of the economy, adjusting our desires to the reality principle. A Marxian economist of an old-fashioned sort trumpeting the predictive power of Marxism makes the same childish error as does a badly educated mainstream economist thinking that the future of grain prices is predictable. A grown-up epigram would be, the point is to know history, not to change it. The best economic scientists of whatever school have ever believed in profitable casting of the wars. If only. Despite the seductive discourse of maturity here, the limitation of McCloskey's position is twofold. On the one hand, McCloskey somewhat distorts what is actually and historically the casting of the pores. That is to say, what is actually and historically the nature, scope, and diversity of divination. This practice, although in certain traditions predictive, is overwhelmingly an attempt to investigate hidden causes or unknown factors in the past and present. That is to say, divination is precisely involved in the kind of storytelling that McCloskey already argues economics should be. That's one problem. The other problem is more subtle and cuts to the heart of economics itself. Despite the fact that grain prices are not, in fact, predictable, it's nevertheless the case, as McCloskey herself admits, that economic activity still depends, in the last instance, on a kind of genius, inspiration, or intuition. That is to say, precisely on the talents and capacities that are associated, historically and actually, with the perennial and global practice of divination. It is Philip Goodchild, in his magisterial and oracular work, Theology of Money, who puts this problem in a framework that is more applicable to my own approach. The core of Goodchild's point is that some form of divination is necessary, even in economic science, precisely because money is not merely a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Money is also a vehicle that mobilizes credit. That is, it's a power to evaluate potencies, where potencies are understood as possibilities that have not yet been realized, but of which we have, or at least some of us have, a dim awareness. This is what's called making an investment. This awareness, what modern people tend to call inspiration, intuition, or genius, and what Keynes called animal spirits, which is why there's a statue of a bull, by the way, by Wall Street, because that's what that represents, is this animal spirit that makes certain people successful and able to stay in the game. This cannot be produced through the development of knowledge in the conventional sense of studying, analyzing, and representing data, or by following rules for induction from past experience. The dim awareness that underwrites the generation of credit depends on a theology. That is, a prior set of convictions about ultimate meaning, purpose, and value that direct attention, these convictions direct attention by underwriting our expectations. That is to say, by generating faith and hope in advance of evidence and experience. This is from Theology of Money. The difficulty in assessing economic opportunities lies in the fact that such opportunities have to be proved in experience. Once proved, the opportunity no longer remains. That's the same form as the $500 bill problem. Exact same logic. There is thus no true science of economics because the realization of economic value depends more on divination than it does on public evidence. See, I didn't make this up. Good job being to it for you. In addition to the sciences of production and distribution that deal with order, in addition to the sciences of anthropology and psychology that deal with desire, there's also a theology of credit. Such credit is grounded in a dim awareness of economic opportunities, whether in unrealized possibilities for order or in unachieved satisfactions of desire. What's at stake here, then, is not simply a matter of profit for an isolated entrepreneur or single corporation, which is sort of the mistaken impression you get from McCloskey that the whole problem is that individual economic agents can't strike it rich, but the problem is much worse than While McCloskey sees that profitability is not subject to prediction, she does not address the impact of speculation on the constitution of markets, or, that is, the fact that the very institution of credit, which makes any economic activity possible, in fact, is a matter of divination. In other words, for there to be markets, there first has to be credit. And this is something that every economics textbook in the world presents backwards. Every economics textbook starts with exchange and talks about how credit structures grow out of fundamental exchange. But anthropologists have been telling us for 150 years that there never has been a society based on exchange. It takes unbelievable structures of faith and credit and mutual solidarity before people even begin to imagine the idea of swapping things at equivalence. Okay, and because of this, this situates not only economists, but more precisely those who are perceived to be most successful, in a strange position of determining not only their own wealth, but determining for the economy as a whole what is valuable, what is worth valuing. Because such success is coded under capitalism as the ultimate political and cultural value, those who are successful at the cultivation of awareness of economic opportunity become immediately imbued with the power and prestige of establishing, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, the value of values themselves. This is a few more paragraphs from Goodshot. Wealth may be considered capital, the ability to produce order. Yet while capital produces order in reality, it is desire that gives value to order, and thus to capital in evaluation. The question arises then of what gives value to desire. This is a theological question concerning the value of values, the value of desires, and the value of evaluations. If society is based on contract rather than exchange, contract itself, another way of thinking of contract is a credit relationship. I trust you or believe that you will fulfill your agreed upon obligations. Contract itself is insufficient to represent values and opportunities that act on and through the mind. Such economic forces may operate through the imagination. One is not faced with a false choice between the transparency of knowledge, where thinking represents reality, and complete uncertainty and ignorance. Values may not be known in themselves, yet they still act over the course of time, producing a tendency toward destination. What's necessary for the divination of value is some kind of supple, imaginative body that is capable of being affected by and indicating the potency of forces of evaluation. What is also required for the verification of such divinations is an experimental method for the realization of value. This theology of evaluation underlies credit. So last section, about 8 minutes left. Thank you so much for long attention here. I really appreciate it. Obviously, this right here, this is where the political problems of a politics of divination are set to begin. Who acquires the prestige and prerogative over the auspices? Who is given authority to conduct the experimental verifications of the divinations that evoke and seek to elicit new potencies and unrealized value? What tends to happen in democratic capitalism, as Goodchild points out here, is a strange paradox by means of which the question of what is creditworthy is returned to the very marketplace that must itself be supported by the divination of creditworthy enterprises. That's because, in the last instance, it tends to be overwhelmingly in marketplaces that contemporary democratic societies seek consensus on evaluations. But all this does is to defer the problem of what is truly creditworthy indefinitely. And effectively what this does is to increase pressure on already profitable activities to become ever more profitable, to the detriment of new or alternative modes of human and natural capital obtaining the credit that might otherwise deserve. In this heinous endgame, we witness the wanton destruction of more and more potential sources of value, including at the limit, the earth itself. All because, in the last instance, we lack the political will to accept the authority to organize, deliberate, and evaluate our modes of evaluation outside the marketplace, leaving authority in the last instance in the hands of speculators, those who are in no way dependent upon markets, but are in the unassailable position of absolute independence from any actual flow of creative or destructive consequence. The theological reason global capitalist society finds itself in this self-destructive complicity with the abnegation of all authority over its evaluative powers has to do with a deeply pernicious religious commitment to a logic of sacrifice and a confused and perverse theology of chance. That is to say, the willingness of global society to sacrifice the majority of humanity and terrestrial life to the fluctuation of market forces is grounded in a sacrificial commitment to the religion of contingency. What I call the religion of contingency is not the divinatory willingness to go by chance, to work with chance, but a subordination of the human and by all accounts non-human process to chance as such. It is a kind of perverse chaos religion that employs a covert, confused, and ultimately destructive mode of divination, grounded not upon atheism, but upon the twin idolatries of devotion to chance and to fate. Henri Atlan can help us clarify this point and put it into a modern idiom. The traditional theological position is that God's will, at least in monotheism, that God's will is not ultimately subject to determination by natural laws. That is to say, God is ultimately not subject to chance, let alone fate. Atlan, on the contrary, is a Spinozist, and he believes God's will, quote unquote, is simply an imaginative name for the laws of nature. As such, albeit with the crucial caveat that we do not yet have complete knowledge of nature, and thus we are in nearly total ignorance as to what is the will of God, at least as it might be manifest in the unfolding of events. There remains for Atlan, however, the contemplative practices, including esoteric disciplines, but also for him, including the sciences themselves, that reveal the mind of God or nature, but in a slow and tortuous process that itself for Atlan constitutes our salvation. This salvation or freedom is constituted by an ongoing act of communal interpretation. As Atlan puts it, God/nature is intelligible, conveying either meaning or absurdity, depending on how human beings represent it to themselves and how they behave in consequence. It is the same chain of cause and effect, which is absurd or meaningful, as a function of the world of meanings, respectively impersonal or personal, that human beings invent as speaking and thinking beings, and they are caught in the web of their own actions and of the natural events that intersect them. Now, what this means, in Atlan's view, and I gave you that in this talk because I think that's a fairly robust and interesting sort of secular or post-secular sort of atheism that maybe a lot of people unconsciously would subscribe to. We can talk about that later. Now, what this view implies is that even in a modern era where chance is desacralized, that is, where ordinary modern scientific people don't believe that chance is oracular or tells us anything, at least they think they don't believe that it tells us anything. In this context, where we no longer treat chance as an oracle, Atlan, for his part, still thinks that chance has an extraordinary role to play, okay, even for modern secular culture. He's going to draw this out in his work by reference to the evolution of the Jewish celebration of the Day of Atonement. Now, in this work, The Sparks of Randomness, that I'm reading from here, Atlan points out that in the traditions of Talmud and Midrash, an enormous amount of commentary is devoted to articulating exactly what role chance and divinatory process should continue to play for post-Second Temple Judaism, the era in which, according to rabbinic tradition, prophecy is over, and it is only by means of the written Torah that God continues to reveal himself to the people. On numerous occasions in the Bible, chance still seems to play a role in the unfolding of the divine will. Lots are cast in order to divine the will of Yahweh, and the priests are regularly instructed to use the mysterious divination tool of the Urim Ve'Tumim, a kind of breastplate studded with jewels on which were inscribed various letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The priest would allow his hand to move at random across the jewels, interpreting the divine will based upon the significance of the signs. Now, the Day of Atonement is one of the most solemn ceremonies in Judaism to the present day. It's a reenactment of the dramatic scapegoat ritual, ordained in the book of Leviticus, in which the high priest cast lots to determine which of two identical goats would be sacrificed in the altar for the sins of the entire people. An account of this rite is read in synagogues once a year this very day. But what role does something like chance or divination play in a post-prophetic age, an age in which no oracle is presumed to speak through the signs? Through reflections on the Talmud, Midrash, and on Kabbalistic writings, Atlan shows that although the rabbinic tradition is at great pains to warn the community in the post-prophetic age against treating chance as an oracle, it is nevertheless vitally important to reserve a role for chance to play when it is not possible, even temporarily, to overcome ignorance and discover the truth. So when we're in situations where we cannot, or at least for the moment, make a decision, there's a role for chance to play. While it is no longer appropriate, as it was in the book of Joshua, to use sortilege to determine the guilt of Achan in violating the ban on taking plunder after a battle, there is nevertheless, even for a post-prophetic age, at least one crucial usage of divination that must be defended at all costs: the division of the promised land among the 12 tribes of Israel. This is a remarkable point, and it's obviously an economic one. What Atlan has to say about it, while rooted in reflections on Jewish religion, has striking relevance for a modern secular view of chance, and for understanding the nature of the ambiguities and paradoxes that continue to undermine political struggles, among other things, for economic justice. And I'm just going to look at this passage, and then I have one brief comment on it, and that'll be it. So this is all on the Day of Atonement and modern sacramental chance. On the Day of Atonement, the role of lottery is clear. In some fashion, it restores the unity that the opposition between God and devil seems to shatter. The lottery means that the choice between these two goats is indifferent, because somewhere the two goats are only one, just as God and the devil are only two aspects of the unity above. By the same token, the apportioning of the land among the tribes must not destroy the unity, whether of the people or of its land, the unity first represented by the portable sanctuary and then by the Temple of Jerusalem, seat of the Ark of the Covenant, that contain the two tablets of the Law of Moses. In this desire to protect the verdict of the lottery, even in the absence of an oracle, and despite all the ambiguities we have found in the Talmudic commentaries, and man, there's some ambiguities, there are hundreds of years of debate about how it would be possible that Almighty God would have to use something like chance to deal with us. Really incredible stuff. But we see how the role of chance is taken into account by knowledge and action. Chance as ignorance of causes and recognition of the impossibility of making a choice with full knowledge of the state of things is an opening, in contrast to the closure of a prepackaged meaning or of the desire for rationality and price. The impatient illusion of total knowledge is at least as dangerous as the arbitrariness of flashes of inspiration and their interpretations. Here we learn that the arbitrariness of chance may be preferable to the arbitrariness of the choice, just as ignorance recognized as such is preferable to false knowledge, or atheism to idolatry. In all these cases, knowledge that there are no causes that we really know, knowledge of our ignorance, is preferable to indication of hypothetical causes, partially or totally hidden, as if we knew them. For in the latter case, we designate these hidden causes by different names, such as those of partial causes inappropriately generalized, like genes, for instance, or by God as the first cause, and then employ them as magicians do, getting everything straight away, overcoming our impatience with an imperfect knowledge in which truth springs up from the earth and then grows slowly and laboriously. Understanding that chance has a role to play, even when it can no longer serve as an oracle, means recognizing that we cannot act as if our knowledge of causes is complete. In other words, desacralized chance still retains its value as theoretical possibility of knowledge that is still hidden. Unlike the oracle, it does not pretend to have any truth value or any utility as a means of discovering the hidden knowledge. It does make it possible to transform ignorance into a possible opening to the future, without reducing this ignorance in the slightest or in any way guaranteeing the truth or correctness of a decision dictated by the outcome of the lottery, when all else fails and in despair of achieving full knowledge. The parties' agreement to submit to such a verdict, like that of the tribes who divided up the land, makes it possible to make progress by means of a method that, as we have seen, also forges a kind of unity among the parties, of the sort that at least concludes the dispute and puts an end to the contest. As an opening to indeterminate possibility, Chance makes it possible to break out of the confinement of incomplete meaning and knowledge that think themselves perfect. The arbitrariness of the illusion of knowledge is replaced by the conventional arbitrariness of the lottery, even if it entails constructing a new meaning, partial and provisional, based on that arbitrariness. This is why a lottery, unlike sworn testimony, is binding only because of the party's consent and not because of its ostensible truth. As such, it can serve to set things in motion when progress is otherwise impossible, but only on condition that things and not human beings are at stake, sharing our property, which is by definition exchangeable and permanent and subject to devaluation and reevaluation, is the end. As for the scapegoat, the victim chosen by lot, it is allowed a role in regulating violence, but with no illusions that anything can be known about its culpability, because its guilt is that of society as a whole, and at the limit inherent in the nature of things and the world it created. It is precisely this recognition that is expressed by the use of chance in the ritual, shifted first from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice, and then to a mere narration of human sacrifice. There are several things to learn here. One is that something like divination is not only occasionally, but fundamentally and foundationally necessary for politics, or more precisely for political economy, as well as by implication for other areas of human investigation. Nevertheless, if we agree to go by chance, or go at random, in cases where there is no alternative, a provisional meaning must still be constructed from the outcome of the cast, the spread, or the statistical finding. The danger, of course, is the false prestige that attaches to these provisional interpretations and contingent agreements, making revision and recasting exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, in the face of the overwhelming material interests of the status quo. For the moment, it seems we are still committed, at least as a culture at large, to a cult of human sacrifice where chance is used in an oracular fashion, not for the provisional distribution open to revision of wealth and power, but for the direct evaluation of human life as such. We, at least those of us who continue to perform the rites of speculation, do not overcome the illusion that nothing, or very little, can be known about those losers upon whom the misfortune of poverty, denial of credit, and destruction of human potential has been fomented by the chance fluctuations of money. We do not admit that the guilt for impoverishment is a guilt to be visited upon society as a whole. We do not admit that the misfortune inherent in economic gains is germane to the fragility and finitude of the world as created. We insist, at least as an imperial culture writ large, across the laudatory media spectacle, that the misfortunate are so by nature, by essence, and by destiny. For now, we would rather placate the great god of chance than bear the weight of both our ignorance and our capacity to cultivate collective awareness of potential. But what if chance is not a great god, but more like a subtle, familiar spirit? After all, in language, in art, and even in science, chance is a local, finite X factor, an opportunity, a happenstance, an opening, a subtle shift. True divination is practiced not for chance or in chance, but by chance, alongside chance, thanks to chance. The way forward, by chance, is, politically speaking, archaic. It is the demand of the people for the right to interpret chance, to have their chances interpreted, with the same dignity as those of the elites. This has been, on Vico's account, the problem of how democracy emerges all along, not on the basis of the seizure of power by the outcasts, but by the idea that all are equally worthy of being able to determine who and what is worthy. And this will continue to be done, as it has been, by divination. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, so I think we have about 25 minutes
All right.
for questions. If you need to get up and take a quick
Yeah, do it.
break or whatever, please feel free to go ahead, but I think we'll go ahead and also start right into the questions in order to maximize our use of time. Are you happy filling in yourself?
Yep. Yeah, anyway.
I have a dummy.
All
I
right.
just want clarification.
Yeah.
Because I got it, but this is the way with statistics and probability is sort of slightly evaporated.
Right.
Just to re-explain the error that you identified about Porter and what you talk in terms of looking at statistics not as a way of canceling out, you know, bad bets, but as a way of creating positive knowledge.
Right. So the basic idea is that what the statistical testing of hypotheses do is enable us to look at correlations. So you can look at, you know, for instance, how many people who you can look at the correlation between, say, marijuana use and heroin use, right? But it's one thing to ask, for instance, you know, what is the percentage of people who, you know, use pot and use heroin, and to conclude from that that, you know, say pot usage likely to lead to heroin usage. And it's another thing to do a different study, which is to look forward at how many people who use pot right now eventually, you know, use say heroin or something like this. So depending on how you look at it, the correlations always have to be interpreted. Okay? So the discovery of correlation is never directly the discovery of a causal relationship. This is Atlan's big point. And Henri Atlan is a geneticist, he's a philosopher, he's a member of the Legion of Honor in France, very well respected, but he's been, among many other people, been, you know, criticizing the misuse of statistics. He still thinks that, you know, statistical sciences are a huge step forward scientifically, but we tend, in our representation of what, you know, we're finding, to make that error. We treat correlations as discovery of causes. And the point is that science, especially physics actually, which led the way on this, shifted into making very heavy use of the laws of probability theory to look at to look at, you know, thermodynamics and things like this, precisely because they gave up on the search for the cause, right? So it was advanced through a kind of acceptance of ignorance, right? But you can see how this is so massively misused, especially in the human sciences, and the massive policy implications as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Josh. That was really brilliant and beautiful.
Thank you.
I love your helping us see the continuity between pre-modern perennial anthropological currents and apparently completely disenchanted secular world. And I also really love and affirm the liberatory thrust of your politics. And I had just a couple of questions. Take your pick, just to comment on. How do you understand, for instance, even with the crash, the last big crash, there were still people who are making, whose divinatory power seems to be early on, at least in the shorter term. There's still people making lots of money who are really good bettors and using whatever systems they're using, at least in the shorter term. It's just one sort of observation. Also, prior to the last big crash, there were a few people. I remember reading some. I can't remember who, in Global Research Foundation is a website and so on. They were predicting the crash at least 3 years ahead of time. But of course, they were completely ignored, and even what's her name, former head of HUD, who worked with Michael Rupert and what's that, Fisk.
Yeah.
Fisk, anyway. She for years was sort of predicting what was going on and making recommendations. At least in retrospect, she was right. So there are apparently for some people really compelling successes in their predictability with economics. Some who are in the interests of just pure greed, others apparently more in the interests of a kind of reclaiming of value and commons that you're talking about. So I'm curious what you would say about that, and I've forgotten the third one I was going to ask. Maybe just that for a second, if that
Okay.
triggers anything.
Okay.
Catherine Ann Fisk.
Let me give the answer that I think would be given by sort of my champion of capitalism, Deirdre McCloskey, because I think she's really smart, and although I'm obviously deeply anti-capitalist, she's incredibly persuasive. A lot of her arguments are, and I learned a lot from her. But I think she would just basically say, look, those people could have been wrong too, and there's no a priori systematic way for us to pick the winning predictors and losing predictors before the event unfolds. There's just too many contingencies that might have occurred. In the meantime, there could have been a war or something that would have intervened before 2008 that would have totally changed the game. So we would never have known if that person would have been right. I mean, Nicholas Taleb in The Black Swan makes this argument all over the place, right? I know Matthew, some of the people have been reading that on here. I mean, he's a really good way into this. And the other thing is that routine predictions of all different kinds, like people being able to predict the weather changing a few days out, and routine economic prediction, is rational. I mean, it has an empirical basis. You can learn the rules, how to make any inductions, so on, right? So, but not so with the extraordinary events. I mean, I feel the temptation to ask what somebody was thinking who predicted 2008. Sure. I mean, I don't think that I would be denying that they knew anything, right? But I don't think that it's logically correct to say that before the event transpired they knew it was going to happen. I think that's actually a category mistake.
No, it's only in retrospect. It's only in retrospect.
Yeah, it's only in retrospect, exactly. So good. So that's the point actually from which precisely we can begin to understand how economists and other social scientists, but I'm focusing on them, do play the role in modern secular culture that diviners play in lots of other cultures, which is precisely to tell retrospective stories about why things turned out the way that they did. Right? If you look at this ethnographically, and I'm sure some of you in here practice divination for contemplation in some way or other things, something occurs, you have a crisis, you might turn to your divination tool, and, at least in my experience, my tools don't tell me, oh, this is the solution to your problem. What usually happens is I get provoked to think, the problem isn't what I thought it was. There's actually a different problem behind what I thought was the problem, right? So I'm invited into this interpretive space, right? Sure, well, that's exactly where economists are in our culture. The problem is that politically speaking, there's a prestige that attaches to them insofar as some of them, by chance, are extraordinarily successful. Okay? Now, what I'm interested in is the logic of the way in which we agree as a society, tacitly and unconsciously, right, with leaving them in those positions, right? And it has something to do with this very deep confusion that modern people have about the role of chance. I think this is my speculation. This is what my hypothesis is, right? This weird sense in which even if someone was successful or right by chance, right? Well, chance is in some sense our God. We all play the lottery, and we know that there's some message for us that comes from chance, and so it's that aura around people who occupy those positions that I'm trying to prize apart. I'm trying to sort of put in the clinic. I think, you were next too.
I'm not really sure how to, this has been great, by the way, I just want to say it's awesome. and this is kind of out there question, but I'm curious what maybe you would say about the connection between chance and certain ideas that are happening in quantum physics, like the parallel universe idea or something like that, that describing chance as a relationship between, say, objects in space or something like that, that in a sense all options are taking place in some. Do you have any thoughts about that, or feel free to dismiss the question?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you this. I'm reading a really good book right now on quantum physics and philosophy of Whitehead. It's called, I think it's just called Whitehead Quantum Physics, or actually by a guy up in Sacramento. Do you know this book, Jacob? Epperstein or Epperson?
Is it an edited book, or
What's that?
is it an edited book?
No, it's a monograph. I think it's just called Alfred North Whitehead and Quantum Physics. But as far as I understand it, the hypothesis of multiple universes, or the multiverse, I mean, it's one of the working hypotheses for thinking about sort of, the biggest issues in cosmology. I mean, I'm in no position to weigh in on any of this. And I don't know what I would say about what I'm talking about in terms of chance relates to that at all. But maybe you have an idea as you were listening that,
Well,
I'm just
I don't
wondering
know.
how it's resonating with you.
I'm just like, I'm really excited by the idea of chances as a way of talking about the relationship between realities, or about that. And I'm really excited by
Okay.
that anti-capitalist stance that you're offering here is also sort of a re-examination or reifying of magic as a valid system. Or like, at least that's what I'm getting. That like, for me, the definition of magic is reality. So it's like a more humble stance towards reality then would have to acknowledge that, say, even though I'm seeing or experiencing through the sense field certain events taking place, that doesn't necessarily that doesn't mean that my perceptions are accurate.
Okay.
Too, so that like, even though I'm saying, oh, I won the lottery, then maybe that isn't what actually happened. Do you know what I mean? So that even who's benefiting from what, or what is good, what is bad, those are all sort of like, from a more humble stance, like we have no idea. Because like being more ignorant is sort of like a more interesting place to occupy, I think, as like an economically functioning being. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. It's Northern California, so I feel like I can say these things.
You can. Yeah, especially around me. Yeah, no, I think I'm resonating with what you're saying. I mean, one of the things that's making me think about, though, is that at least as far as I understand it, and people who know physics better than I do in here can correct me on this, but quantum mechanics never predicts which outcome, which exact actual path will be taken by a physical event. It simply presumes that one of them will be, and then on that basis is able to calculate the nature of the probability space. Okay, that's, as far as I understand it, that's okay.
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things about that is that I think our tendency is, psychologically, is to sort of fixate on our actuality, or whatever that happens to be, right? And then to try to think of stories about why that was necessary, right?
Yeah, right.
And one of the things that quantum mechanics is doing is it's saying you're never going to have an answer to that question, right? And this is that step back that I think Atlan is also doing for us from a totally different perspective. But it's interesting because he's not saying, don't practice divination, don't try to discern the meaning of events, right? He's saying basically something like, don't practice divination as a form of idolatry. Don't like the first quote, don't use the oracle to the extent that you are willing to not pretend that you know exactly what it means.
Yeah.
So it's this return of the power to reconstruct the meaning and that Atlan thinks paradoxically is the role of chance in our lives. It's thanks to the fact that there is chance that we get to reinterpret our existence. Not that we get to say, oh, I have a destiny, or oh, I was fated to be this or that. Okay? But this is really, really interestingly and dangerously political, because you see how this is constantly playing out as we try to justify it to ourselves, the unbelievable sacrifices that capitalism demands of us and demands of the planet, right? We have to tell these stories about why those sacrifices were necessary, right? And the first thing, and that, of course, this is a little bit of a rehash here, but the first step in that story usually is, well, we know that everybody has a chance in capital. Everybody has a chance to make it, or it's by chance that wealth is distributed in a way X, Y, or Z. But see how that does exactly the opposite of what Atlan wants chance to do. That ends the discussion. Instead of allowing it to be the point at which we say, well, and if it's by chance, then we can renegotiate. It could have been you on the end of my student loan, right? And for your kids, it probably will be, But anyway, yeah, there were some other people. Thanks. Yeah.
I was trying to say, interesting, I used to work as the top economic forecasting firm in the country, and I always thought, that even at the time, that it was a bit surreal. It was like the Wizard of Oz, because we had our guru, our oracle, our seer, who had worked for the president, and he was the guy, and we had this huge, it was the largest computer outside of the Pentagon, and we had all this staff of people and all this paper and all this stuff generated by the computer, but it was basically our guy who gave us all the stuff that we fed into the computer to come out, and we worked around the clock to make it come out with the stuff that he put in. And then all the people on Wall Street.
You're like human tarot cards.
Exactly what it was, and even had a big article like in the Forbes or something that said, "To the prophets go the prophets," right? And and we all kind of knew it was like, because we had this big computer and all this paper and all these numbers and all these economists, they believed it. We all kind of knew it was just BS. It was like, it was just, we were all a bunch of stone people sitting around going all night working on these numbers. And then after that, I was working for another place called Institute for the Future, where we were doing this stuff called the Delphic method. And what that meant was just finding all the experts and getting them to come to a consensus. So it's the same, but I felt like there's this archetypal need, you said, for this. And we would give them all the probabilities, which again were based on, assessments by all these theoretical experts. But people want the probability that they feel is their own assessment, which is what they feel is going to work out best for them. So the probability that we get from our clients, of course, is the one that they think is going to work out best for them. So everyone's looking to get their own Bayesian update of what they think is going to be the best for their own person.
Thank you. Which is, of course, the $500 bill paradox.
Exactly.
Right? Because you have other people consulting other firms for what's going to work out best for them.
And of course, it's an echo chamber effect too.
Yeah,
because everyone's just going around going.
Yeah. Wow. Not for more than like a day or two, but I wish I could have had that job. I know what I'm talking about a little more here. Yeah.
Stemming off of that and thoughts I've had earlier about forget how it's worded exactly, but that quote of "your fortune isn't your fortune until it's told to you," of that moment of the fortune being told, and thinking about the practice of statistics in the realm of as if you were going to someone, a tarot card reader, reading your fortune, and they tell you something and you're affected by what they've told you. As you were speaking, I was thinking of statistics as like, the way that it can be probable is because it's the same, the logic or the logos in the sense of like the language that it's using is repeating itself again and again, and it's like terrible poetry that keeps on being said again and again and again. So the fact that, but then greater poetry, which is outside of the realm of that poor poetry, can come in and speak itself. So I'm thinking about this sense of like this self-reflexive, what can come to be so by the power of its possibility of generative potential or excitement even in the sheer quality of its statement. And one contingency, have you seen the movie Being There? It's based on the Jersey Krasinski novel.
I'm thinking of myself as a film buff for this.
It's so amazingly pertinent to this, where it's about this man who's worked as this gardener for this old man his whole life. Suddenly the man dies. He's never been outside in the world. And it's played by Peter Sellers.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed that I haven't seen this film.
No, it's fine, but it's just like, to not go on too long, but it's just great because all he knows is from television. Suddenly this car hits him, and it's the wife of this large political figure. And she hears his name, Chauncey, but she hears Chance. And then suddenly he's ushered into this political realm, and all he knows is the language of the garden. And they think that he's this prophetic figure because he's speaking in these metaphors about what's going to happen with, but he has no history, so the CIA is trying to find him and track him down, but he's not tracking him. Anyhow, I recommend it in light of all of that.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think there is something about the media spectacles and the way in which labels, like thinking about drug labels and so on, like the way they present misrepresent what can be known on the basis of statistics. I mean, and the point here, just to be really clear, again, statistical science and probability theory are amazing tools. I mean, they're incredibly useful in the advancement of knowledge and the development of the sciences and so on. But they're also just incredibly slippery and double-edged in the way that they can be represented. So there is something about that, the telling of what we're finding. And I mean, this is a new area for me. I'm starting to read as much as I can about critiques of statistical reasoning and inference and probability theory, but it's amazing that I'm finding, like, for years that there's this heavy critique of the misuse of statistics, heavy critique of our misunderstanding of probability theory, and yet it never seems to be light years away from, as a culture, having anything like real skepticism about what we're being sold, whether that's drugs or capitalism itself. So yeah, go ahead.
This question might come out a little jumbled, but we're looking at chance from a humble perspective, where it's all about us being ignorant about what's going on. Is that necessarily implying then that a metaphysical perspective where if we had enough information, then everything would be predictable and everything does have a cause? And if so, then is that kind of in conflict with a perspective of there being randomness and creativity and new stuff? And who's holding which position in what you've been
Yeah,
talking about?
I ran past the metaphysics pretty quickly in this presentation. It's going to get a bigger workout in the book, and it probably end up being a subsequent book too. But Henri Atlan, who I've been relying on pretty heavily because I'm really fascinated by him right now. He has a kind of, I'll just talk about him for a minute, okay? I have no idea whether determinism is true or whether, I mean it's very difficult questions to resolve, but Atlan is a kind of determinist in the sense that he does believe that everything has a cause in the way that Spinoza did. But he also believes that we are largely ignorant of almost all pertinent causal structures, and that most sciences are as well. And the hypothesis seems to be, and I was a little obscure about this at times, the hypothesis seems to be that chance will always be, a lot of it depends on how you define chance, but chance in the sense of unknown causal factors is simply part of an infinite universe of infinite causal determination, because if those determinations are infinite, then they will always remain to some degree unknown. And basically, by definition, what chance is the intersection of independent, causal vectors that are, intersecting in a way that's unknown to us. That is either in principle beyond what we can know, or or simply is momentarily unknown. So in a weird way, there's a kind of synthesis between the idea of a deterministic cosmos and the reality of chance. Now that's one position. I mean, that's Alan's position. There are a lot of other ones that one might adopt. I haven't even, I'm nowhere near finishing where I think I weigh in on this. I think there's something fascinating about that. This gets really abstract really quickly, because then we get the whole perspectival problem about the, what Spinoza calls, the order of ideas and the order of things. So there's, for Spinoza, those are in parallel. But obviously, we don't know everything that is to be known, and it's hard to know whether we will. And it's also hard to think of that in any sense as some kind of bounded totality. So, I mean, one implication is that we, whoever we are, or mind, whatever mind is, will in some sense radically change or alter with the development of its knowledge, which is something people like to speculate about in terms of the radical sort of possible departure of human consciousness from the body, all these things. But I mean, you're bringing up a lot of really big issues that.
Yeah, it's mostly
yeah.
because you mentioned Whitehead and Bergson, and,
Yeah.
and it felt like in the beginning you were going away from the contingency part of chance and into this relational definition
Yeah.
of it, which is
Yeah,
based on them and stuff. But then at the
I-
end it was kind of like, we should be humble. And I feel like the humbleness kind of implies the determinist metaphysics.
Oh, okay, but not for Atlan. The humility for Atlan is a matter of continuing to research or continuing to try to know by chance, or which is for him precisely sort of the gain we make with statistical science and probability theory. Is it's a way of doing that.